You're listening to the Murder Mindset, where biology meets behavior. We explore the minds behind violence, examining the impulses, motives, and mysteries that shape human behavior.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Murder Mindset. I'm your host, Deirdre, and I finished my Master of Science at Johns Hopkins, and I spent a lot of time studying how development, trauma, stress, and environment shapes the brain. And I learned that a brain never breaks out of nowhere. It actually builds toward a breaking point, slowly, invisibly, and actually often in plain sight. Today's case takes us to Sacramento, California in the late 1970s, and what unfolded there over the course of just a few weeks would force investigators, psychiatrists, and the legal system to confront a very uncomfortable question, which is when a brain becomes so broken that it constructs an entirely different reality, who is responsible for what happens next? I do want to give a trigger warning for today's episode. We will be talking about severe mental illness, psychosis, childhood trauma, graphic violence, child death, and systemic failures in mental health care. Listener discretion is strongly advised. Okay, before we dive into today's case, I do have two things I want to say. One, Happy New Year, everyone. Happy 2026. This is the first episode of the new year. And if you are a new listener or a returning listener, I am genuinely so grateful and so happy to have you here with me and that you are choosing to start your year off with the murder mindset. So thank you so much. The other day, I checked our analytics and I saw that we had 38 different countries tuning in. And that is just so mind blowing. And I'm just so happy reading the comments, getting the messages, and seeing that so many of you are so interested in engaging with these conversations. I also want to say that I had a really interesting conversation with a friend of mine named Marissa. So, Marissa, thank you so much for taking the time to message me. And that is where I got the inspiration of today's case. We talked about schizophrenia a little bit, and it urged me to kind of look into more depth and find a case that covers schizophrenia. If you are not already following us on Instagram, after every episode, I do post a carousel with everyone involved in the case, the victims, locations, just really important details. Go ahead and follow me on Instagram at The Murder Mindset. And then you can also send me a DM about a case or a mental health topic that you are interested in having me cover. And I'm so happy to do that. And yeah, from there, we're going to go ahead and jump into today's case. Richard Trenton Chase was born on May 23rd, 1950 in Sacramento, California. He was the eldest of two children born to Beatrice and Richard Edgar Chase. So on paper, this family looked like a really normal, typical middle-class family. Presbyterian, suburban, two kids, a house with a yard, but inside that house, normal unfortunately did not exist. Beatrice Chase lived in a constant state of paranoia. She was convinced that her husband was cheating on her, and worse, she actually believed that he was trying to poison her. And these weren't fleeting worries, they were fixed beliefs, and they colored every single interaction, every meal, and every moment of family life. So Richard Edgar, the father, was known to be very strict. Discipline was physical, rules were non-negotiable, and warmth was absent. And this household operated on control, not connection. And the fights between these two were constant and actually sometimes violent. So for the children, Richard and his younger sister Pamela, they learned early that home was not a place where you relaxed. It was a place where you stayed alert, where you anticipated, where you tried to read the room before the room exploded. And in the early 1960s, as the marriage deteriorated further, the children actually went to go live with relatives in Los Angeles so Beatrice and Richard Edgar could kind of attempt to reconcile their marriage. Those attempts did fail, and by the time Richard was 14, his parents had separated, and then him and his sister did return back to Sacramento. And here's what matters neurologically. So, chronic childhood stress physically reshapes the brain. When a child grows up in an environment of unpredictability and fear, their amygdala, which is the brain's threat detection center, becomes very hyperactive. It is constantly scanning for danger because danger is real and it's frequent. And at the same time, the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain responsible for rational thought, emotional regulation, and reality testing, develops poorly because it needs stability and safety to mature properly. And we know that Richard did not have that. So by adolescence, Richard's brain was already operating with a hair trigger alarm system and no effective effective way to regulate it. So think of it kind of like a smoke detector that goes off every single time you breathe and you have no way to turn it down. It wasn't just the environment, it was also how Richard responded to it. Teachers and peers described him as very withdrawn and disconnected, as you could totally imagine why. He didn't form close friendships and he had a lot of trouble relating to kids his own age. It kind of showed that this was a clear sign that connecting with others felt difficult and even threatening. And kids that kind of grow up in a home like this, they do have trouble relating to other people because they learn and when their brain is developing that connections aren't constant or stable or safe. So it makes sense that when he would, go into school or the outside world, these fears and struggles escalated into his outward behavior because he's acting and reflecting on the environment that he knows. And then something else started to emerge. Richard became increasingly preoccupied with his physical health in ways that went far beyond normal worry. So family members noticed that he started to fixate on his heart, his organs, his blood, and he believed that he was sick. He thought his body was failing and that he was being poisoned. He went to the doctor multiple times for this and they found nothing. Tests came back normal, but Richard still could not let it go. These weren't passing worries, they were fixed beliefs that did not shift even when confronted with evidence. And what we're seeing here is actually called hypochondria, or what clinicians are now calling illness anxiety disorder. And in children, this manifests as persistent excessive worry about having a serious illness despite medical reassurance. But here's what's important to understand. Children don't develop hypochondria in a vacuum. There are typically a few pathways. Sometimes it stems from early exposure to serious illness, like their own or a family member's, which teaches the child that their bodies are very fragile and dangerous. And then sometimes it's also learned behavior that can be modeled by anxious caregivers who really highlight physical symptoms. And sometimes, like in Richard's case, it's neurological. The brain is beginning to malfunction, how it processes and interprets bodily sensations. So when a child fixates on their heartbeat or their digestion, their breathing, and assigns these very normal sensations catastrophic meaning, we're often actually witnessing the early formation of psychosis. Not always, but often, because the brain's interoceptive system, which is the one responsible for reading internal body signals, is misfiring. It's sending alarm bells when there's no threat, and that child begins to construct a narrative around those false alarms, like I'm dying, I'm being poisoned, something is very wrong. And this kind of somatic obsession in a child is a red flag. It shows that the brain is misfiring internal signals, and that reality testing, like the ability to check your perceptions against external evidence, is starting to break down. So by his mid-teens, Richard was already showing a constellation of warning signs. We already see through teachers and peers social isolation. Now we're seeing paranoid thinking, somatic delusions, emotional flatness, and a brain that had been marinating in chronic stress since early childhood. At that point, that is when he added fuel to the fire. So around 16 or 17, Richard actually started experimenting with drugs like alcohol, marijuana, LSD, and psychedelics don't automatically break a brain. Most people who take LSD have an intense experience and move on with their lives just fine, but Richard was not most people. He was already showing cracks like the social isolation, the paranoid thinking, the obsessive worries about his body, and for someone whose brain is already struggling, psychedelics can actually act like gasoline thrown onto a smoldering fire. And here's why. Because your brain, it has a filtering system and it's centered in the thalamus, which is the area that decides what information is important and what can be ignored. So for example, right now, you're not consciously processing every single sound around you or every shadow in your peripheral vision. Your thalamus acts like a bouncer at a club and it lets in only what matters. And when you take LSD, essentially it fires that bouncer. It floods your serotonin receptors and shuts down the filtering system. So suddenly every single sound, every sensation, every stray thought comes rushing in with equal weight and intensity. And for most people, this is temporary. It's manageable because the filter comes back on after a few hours, or essentially after the trip ends. But for someone like Richard, whose filtering system was already struggling, whose brain was already assigning too much importance to neutral things, this flood can cause lasting damage. And the filter actually doesn't fully recover. Reality starts to blur in ways that don't fade when the trip ends. And on a deeper level, Psychedelics disrupt how serotonin and dopamine interact in the brain. And when that balance gets thrown off in someone who's already vulnerable, ordinary thoughts can start to feel urgent. Internal fears can feel like external threats. And that line between what's real and what's imagined start to dissolve. And for Richard, these substances didn't just give him a bad trip, they actually accelerated something that was already building inside of him. In December 1973, at age 23, that's when everything came to a head. So Richard walked into an emergency room at American River Hospital in Sacramento in a state of complete distress. He was noted to be wide eyed, filthy, disoriented, and he kept insisting that something catastrophic was happening to his body. He thought that his pulmonary artery had been stolen, that his blood had stopped flowing, his head was changing shape, and he could not breathe. And I know when some people hear this, it can sound like funny or just totally ridiculous. But if you actually think about it, this is literally terrifying. Like, imagine that you believe this so intensely to the point where you literally check yourself into an ER. Like, that is terrifying. Like, I cannot imagine that. I have had my fair share of anxiety and moments of things that just aren't obviously grounded in reality. I'm sure we can all relate to. But when it comes to your body, that is so scary. And the fact that he was like, I can't breathe, he's probably just having an intense panic attack because he can't differentiate reality from what's not real. And so when he was in the ER, they examined him, they found that nothing was wrong, but they realized in that moment, psychiatrically, something was very wrong. So they did admit him to the psych ward, and right then and there, he was diagnosed with chronic paranoid schizophrenia. So it could feel like kind of like a relief, like, okay, there's an answer to what's going on. But I want to pause and explain what that diagnosis means, because this is really the turning point of the entire story. This is literally the point that could change everything, because this diagnosis is very important and how it's handled after. So, schizophrenia is fundamentally a disorder of dopamine dysregulation, particularly in the mesolimbic pathway, which is the brain's reward and salient system. So, dopamine is the neurotransmitter that tells your brain what matters. An example would be when you hear your name being called in a crowded room, dopamine surges and makes that sound stand out. And in a healthy brain, this system is finely tuned. In schizophrenia, it misfires constantly. So neutral events get tagged as critically important, and internal thoughts, like your own internal thoughts, feel like external voices, and random patterns look like meaningful signs. So the brain is essentially drowning in false signals, and it's unable to distinguish what's real from what's not, which is literally so scary. And at the same time that all of this is happening, the prefrontal cortex, which is the brain's executive control center responsible for logic planning and reality testing, shows reduced activity in schizophrenia. So Richard couldn't effectively challenge his own perceptions, and when his brain screamed that his organs were failing, and he literally had no cognitive break to say, wait, let me check that against reality. And this is why antipsychotic medications are seriously so important, because they work by blocking dopamine receptors, specifically the D2 receptors in the mesolimbic pathway. And this doesn't cure schizophrenia, but it does turn down the volume on those false signals, and it creates space for rational thoughts to function. Honestly, it just allows the person to start to distinguish real threats from imagined ones. Constant medication combined with therapy and social support can really prevent catastrophic deterioration and really help with kind of what we see going on in a case like this. But this is kind of, like I said, that turning point. Richard was hospitalized. He was diagnosed. The system had him. And then 2 days later, his mother comes to the hospital and wants him released. The staff did say, like, he needs to stay here a little bit longer, but ultimately he was discharged. I think it's important to maybe try to look at where his mother, Beatrice, might have been coming from, because this was 1973 and the stigma around mental illness was crushing. Families were often told that psychiatric hospitals were places where people went and never came back the same, and the medications available at the time had significant side effects. Watching your child become sedated and emotionally flat was probably terrifying. It would be for any parent. And we know that Beatrice did struggle with paranoid thinking, which likely made it harder for her to trust the medical establishment. She probably believed that she was genuinely protecting her son. And the unfortunate thing was the outcome was obviously the same. This was a very critical window that was missed. So instead of just discharging him with no treatment plan and no follow-up, there should have been rules in place. And I think we have that now, where you can't just be like, okay, you're in active psychosis, you're having severe hallucinations, we're going to send you along and we're not going to check on you. Because obviously, like, with what we know, something terrible is going to happen to that person or the people around him. And again, this was the 70s. I mean, I'm not giving an excuse for the time frame, but I do know that medicine has evolved a lot. We still have a long way to go, but compared to 2026 versus 1973, there's a different system in play. Over the next few years, his life became very unstable. He actually shared an apartment where he lived with friends, and they noticed very odd behavior. Like he would strip naked and just like walk around in common areas. He would accuse them of poisoning him. They noted that he was doing drugs and alcohol excessively, which it was kind of like he was probably trying to numb these voices in his head because that probably was the only time that he would get relief. But we know that him taking a lot of psychedelics was also causing more of the issue. So it was just an awful cycle. After several months, his roommates actually decided that he couldn't live with them anymore. His parents were actually still trying to support him at the time. And after this, they decided to get him his own studio apartment. And they thought that that would probably help instead of realizing probably just needed medication. Living alone was the worst thing that could have happened because social isolation removes the last anchors to shared reality. When you're around other people, their reactions provide feedback. So, like when you say something strange, for example, they'll probably look at you funny. And when you're living alone, like how Richard was, he did not have anyone to reality check his distorted thoughts. There was no one to notice when he stopped eating, sleeping, taking care of himself, and there was no one to really intervene when these delusions started spiraling into something darker. And they did start to spiral much darker. At this point, we know that he has a fixation on his body. He developed an obsessive fixation on blood, just blood alone. He was convinced that his own blood was turning into powder and that his heart was shrinking and that he needed to get like a pure blood supply. And the only way that he could get that is to take it from outside sources. So he started with small animals. And I do want to give a trigger warning. We're going to get into animal harm right now. He bought rabbits from a nearby farm, killed them, and drank their blood. And then when that did not feel like enough, he began injecting rabbit blood directly into his veins with this syringe. So what we see is like his whole entire life right now is occupied with his delusion of trying to survive. So he's injecting rabbit blood into his veins, and this actually caused serious infections. He got septicemia, which is blood poisoning, and it should have killed him. In his fractured logic, the infections weren't proof that what he was doing was harmful. He just thought, okay, this is the wrong source of blood. It was contaminated and I need something more pure. So from there, he went on to kill birds. He would catch them in the park and he would wring their neck and then he would consume their blood. And at this point, he's getting sick. He's in the hospital. He is seeing psychiatrists. I don't think he's seeing them regularly. They do note in his medical records, and I actually do really want to address this. The clinicians named him Dracula or vampire. And this labeling is really, really problematic, right? Because it sensationalizes severe mental illness and it turns a human being experiencing profound psychological suffering into like a monster. This wasn't a vampire or demon. This was a young man whose brain was so broken that he genuinely believed drinking blood was the only way to stay alive. And these kinds of dehumanizing nicknames in medical records reflect how poorly the mental health system understood and treated people with severe psychotic disorders at that time, and honestly, how far we still have to go in destigmatizing these conditions. And the important thing to note here is his antipsychotic medications had been stopped. Reports show that his mother just didn't like them. She didn't like how they made him seem. He was flat, emotionless, and like a zombie. And I can totally understand that. Like, I can understand why the medications were probably taking away whatever was left of her son in her perspective. And she probably thought that she was helping him. But what she did not understand, or what no one had adequately explained to her, was that these medications were the only thing regulating his dopamine system. They were the only thing standing between manageable symptoms and psychotic collapse. And without them, his brain had no brakes. It had no filter and it had no way to distinguish between his internal fears and external reality. And by late 1977, Richard moved beyond harming animals because at that point, the blood supply in his mind was just not enough. December 29th, 1977 began like most days in East Sacramento. The holidays had just passed, families were easing back into routine, decorations were still up, but life had slowed. It was the kind of afternoon where nothing feels urgent and no one expects danger. That afternoon, Ambrose Griffin was at home with his wife. Ambrose was 51 years old, a husband, a father, and someone deeply rooted in his family's life. He and his wife had just returned from the grocery store and were unloading bags in their car in their driveway of their home in Tioga Way. It was an ordinary moment, one that should have ended with them walking inside together. At the same time, Richard Chase was driving through the neighborhood, and by this time, he was experiencing severe psychosis. He believed that his body was breaking down and he needed blood to survive, and like I mentioned, animal blood was just not enough. This belief had actually hardened into a rule that guided his behavior. He believed that a locked door meant he was not welcome, and an unlocked door meant he had permission to enter. In his mind, this rule was not symbolic, it was literal. He tested doors as he drove throughout the neighborhood, and when a door was locked, he moved on. And as Richard had passed Ambrose and his wife in their driveway, he didn't see a couple returning from the store. Through his delusions, he perceived threat, and without leaving his car, he raised a handgun and fired once. Ambrose was struck and collapsed. His wife tried to help him while neighbors called for emergency services, but Ambrose did not survive. He was killed suddenly, without warning, and without any connection to the man who shot him. Police initially treated the killing as a drive-by shooting. There was no apparent motive, no prior conflict, and no explanation that made sense. But what investigators did not yet understand was that the shooting had occurred within a delusional framework, one where Richard believed he was acting in self-defense against dangers that no one else could see. The killing actually briefly relieved the pressure Richard felt, but it didn't resolve it. 3 weeks later, on January 23rd, 1978, the pressure had returned. That afternoon, Teresa Wallen was home alone. Teresa was 22 years old and 3 months pregnant. She had been married to her husband, David, for just over a year. They were preparing for their first child, talking about names, planning a nursery. Richard Chase was again driving through residential streets. He tested doors as he went, and most were locked. And when Teresa stepped outside to take out the trash, she left her front door unlocked, and when she returned, Richard Chase was already inside of her home. Teresa was shot and killed, and she didn't have the chance to escape or even protect herself or the child that she was carrying. Both of their lives ended that afternoon. The crime scene shocked investigators because the violence and post-mortem mutilation made it clear that this was not a typical homicide, but the result of a deeply distorted mind driven by fixed delusions involving blood and bodily decay. Later that day, Teresa's husband, David Wallen, returned from work to find police vehicles outside and a chaplain waiting to speak with him. His wife was gone, their unborn child was gone, and at 23 years old, his future had been irrevocably changed. 4 days later, on January 27th, 1978, Richard Chase acted again. That afternoon, Evelyn Merith, aged 38, was at home with her 6-year-old son, Jason, and her 22-month-old nephew, David Ferreira, which she was babysitting at the time. Evelyn was a mother and an aunt, and she was trusted by her family. Jason, her son, was old enough to feel safe in his home, and David was just a toddler. A family friend named Dan Meredith had actually stopped by her house briefly to check in on them, and he literally was only there for a few minutes. And during that time, Richard had approached the house, and the back door was unlocked. In Richard's mind, that meant he had permission to enter. All 4 of them were killed inside the home. The level of violence made it immediately clear to investigators that they were dealing with something far beyond a conventional crime, because this was not motivated by anger, revenge, or gain. It was driven by psychosis. His mind, as we noted, is detached from reality and operating under its own internal rules. A neighbor actually saw Richard leaving the house during that crime, and he was bloody, and he actually had something in his arm, which would be the baby David, which he actually later took to a church and decapitated and then discarded the rest of his body. But when the neighbor saw Richard leaving the house, she didn't know what was in his hands. She did call the police, and that by that evening, because of that call, he was in custody. Only then did authorities begin to understand the pattern, like the unlocked doors, the delusional belief system, and the catastrophic consequences of untreated severe mental illness intersecting with access to weapons and vulnerable households. What police found inside Richard's apartment confirmed with their worst fears and provided a window into just how profound his psychosis had consumed him. There was blood everywhere. It was on the walls, the floors, the furniture, smeared and dried and layered. They actually found blenders containing blood and bodily tissue, and some of it was partially consumed. They found plates with biological matter on them, sitting on the counter like leftovers from a normal meal, and in the refrigerator, they had actually discovered human organs stored in plastic containers alongside rotting food. They found newspaper clippings about the murders that he'd committed alongside bizarre drawings and writings that reflected thinking. He actually had documented everything, not as trophies in the typical serial killer sense, but as records of what he believed was necessary survival tools. Then they found the murder weapon, which was the .22 caliber pistol, and additional evidence linking him conclusively to all the crime scenes. Forensic analysis would later show blood from all 4 victims in the Muroth home, along with Teresa Wallen's blood from days earlier. During initial questioning, Richard was calm, almost almost detached. He didn't deny being at the homes, and he actually did not express any remorse. And when he was asked why he did it, he literally answered very matter of fact, and he said he needed blood and that his body was failing. He had to protect himself. And he also said his soap dish had been stolen. And the last detail, the soap dish, it made no sense to investigators, but it was actually very significant because in his delusional framework, the soap dish being stolen was proof of a larger conspiracy against him, and it was evidence that he was under attack and had to defend himself. So these weren't excuses and this wasn't manipulation. This was genuinely what he believed, and his brain was feeding him a reality that only he could perceive, and he was acting on with complete conviction. Richard Chase's trial began January 1979, exactly 1 year after his final murders, and the central question wasn't whether he committed the crimes because the evidence was overwhelming and he basically never denied it, but the question was whether he was legally sane when he did it. His defense team argued that he was clearly insane under California law. They presented extensive psychiatric evidence, like his diagnosis of chronic paranoid schizophrenia, his multiple hospitalizations, his delusional beliefs about blood and bodily decay, and his complete break from reality. Multiple psychiatrists took the stand and testified that Richard's actions were the direct result of severe psychotic symptoms because he genuinely believed he was acting in self-defense. Dr. Joel Fort, a psychiatrist who evaluated Richard extensively, testified that his patient exhibited one of the most severe cases of paranoid schizophrenia that he had ever encountered. He described Richard's fixed delusions that he was literally dying from the inside out and that his organs were dissolving and that only consuming blood would save him. That same doctor explained that in Richard's mind, these murders were not crimes, but desperate acts of survival. So when Richard killed, he wasn't thinking about his victims because his brain couldn't even process other people as fully human entities with rights and futures. They were just simply sources of substances that he believed he needed to stay alive, which I know, listening to it, it's just uncomprehendable, and that's why cases like this are just so hard to wrap your head around because his brain is operating different than most of us that are listening to this right now. So that's why we just truly cannot comprehend it. So the defense had also called Dr. Donald Lund, which was a professor of psychiatry at Stanford, and he had explained the neuroscience to the jury in plain terms. So he described how Richard's dopamine system was severely dysregulated and how his brain assigned catastrophic importance to neutral stimuli, that his prefrontal cortex couldn't regulate his impulses or reality test his beliefs. And Dr. Lund said that Mr. Chase's brain was telling him he was dying, and to him, these were acts that were literally as necessary as breathing. But the prosecution told a very different story. Deputy District Attorney Ronald Truman argued that psychosis doesn't automatically equal legal insanity. And drop your comments for this because I'm really curious to hear what you think. He pointed to the fact that Richard tried doors before entering, suggesting that he knew he was trespassing and chose homes where he was less likely to be caught. He noted that Richard fled the crime scenes and initially lied to the police, indicating a consciousness of guilt, and then he also argued that Richard retained enough cognitive function to plan, execute, and conceal his crimes, demonstrated an understanding that his actions were wrong. The prosecution also presented evidence of Richard's prior animal killings, arguing that this showed a pattern of escalating violence that was calculated and not purely delusional. The jury heard testimony from both sides for weeks. They saw crime scene photos that some jurors later said gave them nightmares. I can't even imagine seeing the crime scene photos of this because I read how descriptive the crime scenes were, and I purposely didn't put that level of graphic into the podcast because I know it's really triggering for some people. It's hard to hear, it's hard to read, and so I just can't imagine like seeing the photos. But the jury had heard from multiple members of the victims. Teresa's husband David, who testified through tears about coming home to find his pregnant wife dead. Evelyn's relatives described it as unbearable pain of not just losing Evelyn, but two children in a single afternoon. Amberosa's wife, who said that she still flinched every single time she heard a car door slam. And there was so much emotional weight in the courtroom, it was honestly just crushing. The jury deliberated for 5 hours, and when they returned, their verdict was clear: guilty on 6 counts of first-degree murder. And they found that despite his mental illness, Richard understood the nature of his actions and knew that they were wrong. In the eyes of the law, he was sane. The same jury then had to decide his sentence. The prosecution argued that the brutality of the crimes, the vulnerability of the victims, and the lack of any mitigating factors warranted the death penalty. The defense pleaded for life, arguing that executing a severely mentally ill man who should have been in a hospital, not on a death row, would be a final systemic failure, but the jury chose death, and Richard Chase was sentenced to die in the gas chamber at San Quentin State Prison. Richard was sent to San Quentin's death row in May 1979, and even there, his behavior remained deeply disturbed. He continued to believe that his body was failing, that he was being poisoned, and other inmates actually feared him, not because he was violent, but because his presence was deeply unsettling. He would pace in his cell for hours, muttering to himself about his organs disappearing. He would make bizarre statements. It's even noted that he would try to catch birds throughout the prison windows or when he would go outside and drink their blood. So by all accounts, he was still profoundly psychotic. Prison psychiatrists did prescribe him antipsychotic medication, which he sometimes took and he sometimes refused. And it was noted that when he was medicated, he did become more lucid, but he still remained delusional. And when he was unmedicated, he deteriorated rapidly into complete incoherence. Richard never made it to the execution chamber. On December 26, 1980, just 2 years after his arrest and barely a year and a half into his death row sentence, he was found dead inside of the cell. The official cause of death was an overdose of antidepressants that had been prescribed by his prison doctors, and the manner of death was ruled a suicide. He reportedly hoarded his medication over several weeks and then taken a lethal dose all at once. He was 30 years old. Some investigators later questioned whether it was truly suicide or if the other inmates had done something or forced him to take the pills, but there was no sign of foul play or any signs of struggle. The most likely explanation is that Richard, in a rare moment of clarity or perhaps in a response to unbearable internal suffering, chose to end his life because they found a note in his cell that said, "I can't take it anymore." I definitely think that if he was going through such severe delusions and he's in jail and he's not getting a fix for his delusions and he's literally thinking, "I'm dying, my blood is failing," he's obviously in unbearable internal suffering. I personally don't know if I would say he had a moment of clarity. Some people argue, that he had a moment of clarity and he felt guilt and he took his own life. And I just feel like if he had a moment of clarity, I don't think that all the other surrounding actions were showing any clarity. So, for the families of Richard's victims, his death brought absolutely no closure. Betty Griffin, Ambrose's wife, was left to raise their 2 teenage children alone. In interviews years later, she said that she never understood why her husband had to die, a man who hurt no one, who was simply helping carrying groceries into their home on an ordinary afternoon. She never remarried, and friends said that she was never quite the same. David Wallen was left to process the loss of both his wife, Teresa, and their unborn child. He eventually remarried, and he had children, trying to rebuild a future that had been violently taken from him, but in a rare interview years later, he admitted that the trauma never left, and that he still had nightmares about coming home to that day, about the police cars, the yellow tape, and the moment that he realized Teresa was gone. The devastation to Evelyn Murauth's family was layered and enduring. Evelyn's ex-husband had to bury their 6-year-old son Jason and explain to Evelyn's older children why their mother and brother were never coming home. The loss fractured the family in ways that deepened over time rather than healed. One of Evelyn's daughters later became an advocate for victims' rights, and she said that her mother's murder didn't just take lives, it dismantled an entire family. She said, "We lost Jason, we lost my mom, and in a way, we lost each other too." She said, "Grief like that doesn't always bring people together. Sometimes it just tears them apart." And then there was also Dan Meredith, the family friend who had stopped by Evelyn's house that afternoon. Dan was 52 years old. He wasn't related by blood, but he was family in the way neighbors often are. The kind of person who checked in, who made sure everyone was okay. He was only there for a visit. He stayed a few minutes, and he should never have been in danger. His death left his own family grieving a loss that felt both senseless and invisible. A man killed simply for showing up in kindness in the wrong place and at the wrong moment. Then there was Karen and Robert Freria, the parents of 22-month-old David. They had trusted Evelyn with their son, something parents do without thinking twice, and after David's death, that trust became unbearable guilt layered on top of grief. Karen Ferreira was hospitalized for severe depression in the months that followed, and unfortunately, their marriage did not survive. They did divorce within 3 years. Robert eventually left California entirely, and Karen stayed but withdrew from public life, unable to function in the way that she once had. At Richard Chase's sentencing, Karen's victim impact statement was read out loud. She wrote that her baby's final moments were filled with terror, something that she said she would carry with her for the rest of her life. She said, "There is no punishment severe enough for what was taken taken from us. These families did not receive justice in the way that we often imagine it because Richard Chase's death did not undo the harm, it did not answer the questions, and it did not restore the futures that had been erased. Some family members have spoken publicly in the years since, not to defend Richard Chase, but to name the failure that allowed him to deteriorate so completely. They have actually advocated for stronger mental health intervention laws, for mandatory treatment when someone is clearly losing touch with reality. And they've said it plainly and painfully that if Richard Chase had received sustained and forced psychiatric care, their loved ones might still be here. And they're not wrong. Richard Chase's story isn't just about one man's descent into violence, it's about how a brain, when subjected to the perfect storm of genetic vulnerability, childhood trauma, substance exposure, and untreated mental illness, can create a reality so distorted that horrific violence feels not only justified but necessary. So let's go ahead and break down what went wrong. Genetics and early development played a role. Richard likely had genetic vulnerabilities affecting dopamine and serotonin processing, and these don't cause schizophrenia on their own, but they can create a less stable foundation. 2, childhood trauma was another factor. Chronic stress during critical developmental periods physically changed his brain structure. His amygdala became hyperactive while his prefrontal cortex underdeveloped, leaving him with a hypersensitive alarm system and no way to regulate that. 3, substance use during vulnerable periods accelerated everything. LSD and other drugs during adolescence accelerated the onset of psychotic symptoms and disrupted his brain's filtering system permanently. Then came untreated schizophrenia. Once his psychosis fully emerged, his mesolimbic dopamine pathway was severely dysregulated, and his brain was feeding him a distorted reality with complete neurochemical conviction. Finally, a system failure and social isolation sealed his fate. He was hospitalized and diagnosed, but then he was released way too early, taken off medication, and left alone. The system had him and then let him go. And here is the critical point. This could have been prevented. Antipsychotic medications work. Constant treatment reduces the risk of violence in people with schizophrenia to levels at or below the general population. Richard's medication was stopped. He was left alone, and his brain, unchecked, spiraled into complete psychotic collapse. Right now, there are people experiencing early signs of psychosis who are not getting help. Maybe it's someone in your family, maybe a neighbor, maybe it's a coworker whose behavior has been getting strange. And right now, there are families stopping medications because they don't like the side effects, not understanding that untreated schizophrenia can escalate from manageable symptoms to catastrophic violence. Right now, there are young people experimenting with psychedelics who have no idea that they're genetically vulnerable to psychosis. And right now, there are systems that release people way too early, don't follow up, and assume someone will be fine until they're catastrophically not fine. Understanding the neuroscience of cases like this is not about excusing violence, it's about prevention. It's about recognizing that brains can break just like hearts or kidneys, and when they do, early intervention saves lives. The tragedy of Richard Chase isn't that he was born evil, it's that he was born vulnerable. He was raised in chaos, exposed to the wrong substances at the wrong time, diagnosed correctly, and then abandoned by every system meant to help him. His victims, Ambrose, Teresa and her unborn child, Evelyn, Jason, David, and Dan, paid the ultimate price for that abandonment. We can't bring them back, but we can learn from what happened because we can push for better mental health systems that don't release people mid-crisis. We can educate people about the warning signs of psychosis so families know when to intervene. We can stop stigmatizing mental illness so people actually seek help before it's too late. And we can advocate for mandatory treatment laws that balance civil liberties with public safety. That's the real lesson here. This is what makes this case worth studying, as horrific as it is, because the next Richard Chase is out there right now, and whether they become a tragedy or a recovery story depends entirely on what we do next. So that is today's case. I want to thank you all so much for being here. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. Leave your comments below on today's episode. I'm so interested to hear what you think, especially on the legal aftermath. I know there's a lot of debate with that, and I will see you next time on the Murder Mindset.